sweat dripped into Arthur's eyes, stinging like cheap industrial soap. He drove the final nail into the splintered mahogany of a fence that cost more than his truck. He wasn't looking for a handout, just the promised $400 to pay his daughter's asthma prescription and keep the lights on. But when the iron gates opened, the woman standing on the immaculate patio didn't hand him a check. She handed him a piece of paper that made his calloused hands violently shake. Rainwater pooled in the sagging tarpaulin of Arthur's truck bed, smelling faintly of motor oil and wet pine. It was barely 6 in the morning, the sky a bruised purple over the coastal hills. Arthur cut the engine of his Ford a quarter-mile from the main gate, letting the truck coast to a silent stop against the curb. He didn't want the rattling exhaust pipe to echo through the canyon. Wealthy neighborhoods hated noise. They paid a premium for silence, and Arthur was just a guy hired to fix the perimeter of it. He stepped out, his boots sinking immediately into the saturated earth. The cold bit through his flannel shirt, damp and sharp. He pulled his collar up, grabbing his tool belt from the passenger seat. The leather was cracked, heavy with the weight of hammers, tape measures, and the loose drywall screws that always seemed to migrate to the bottom pouches. His phone buzzed against his thigh. A text from Mrs. Higgins. "Chloe is up, ate her cereal, still coughing a bit." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyelids until bursts of dull light flowered in the dark. Still coughing. That meant the backup inhaler was losing its fight. He needed the prescription refilled today. $85 out of pocket. Plus $40 for Mrs. Higgins watching Chloe on a Saturday. Plus gas. Plus the electrical bill sitting on his cramped kitchen counter, stamped with a final notice in an aggressive red font. He did the math. He was always doing the math. It was a suffocating, endless ticker tape running behind his eyes. If he finished this job by noon, he'd clear $400. Minus the expenses, he'd have exactly $210 left to survive the week. It was enough to breathe, just barely. Arthur walked toward the breach. The estate belonged to Vivian Croft. Everyone in the valley knew the name. She ran a logistics empire that moved billions of dollars of freight across the oceans. Her home was a fortress of glass and concrete, perched on a cliffside that looked down on the rest of the town with cold indifference. Last night's gale-force winds had brought down a massive Monterey cypress, completely crushing a 40-foot section of her custom redwood privacy fence. When Arthur reached the damage, the sheer scale of the mess made his jaw tighten. The tree had already been chainsawed and hauled away by a corporate crew before dawn, leaving behind a chaotic scar of torn earth and shattered wood. Splinters the size of javelins littered the manicured grass. The smell of fresh sap was overwhelmingly sweet, clashing horribly with the metallic tang of mud and wet asphalt. He didn't waste time cursing. He dropped his belt, pulled his pry bar, and got to work. The physical labor was mindless, which was exactly what Arthur needed. He ripped out the ruined posts, the agonizing shriek of bending nails ripping through the quiet morning. Wood fibers dug into his bare hands, slipping past the thick calluses he'd built up over 15 years of framing houses. He ignored the sting. Pain was a metric of progress. If he wasn't hurting, he wasn't earning. By 9 o'clock, the fog began to burn off, replaced by a humid, heavy heat. Arthur stripped down to his grey undershirt. His bad left knee, a souvenir from a scaffolding fall in his 20s, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. He measured the spans, cut the new redwood planks with a battery-powered circular saw, and started setting the posts. Every time he swung his hammer, his mind drifted back to his apartment, to the smell of Chloe's strawberry shampoo, to the missing front tooth that made her smile look slightly mischievous. She wanted to go to the Natural History Museum tomorrow. $7 for kids, $15 for adults, $22. He could swing it if he didn't eat lunch today or tomorrow. You're cutting the angle too shallow. Arthur froze, his hammer suspended mid-swing. The voice was smooth, devoid of inflection, slicing through the hum of his saw like a razor blade. He turned. Standing 10 feet away on the other side of the property line was a woman. She wore dark slacks and a charcoal cashmere sweater that looked soft enough to melt into. She held a ceramic mug in one hand, steam curling lazily into the damp air. No makeup, hair tied back in a messy, ruthless knot. She didn't look like a billionaire. She looked profoundly, deeply tired. The bags under her eyes matched his own. "Excuse me." Arthur wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a streak of sawdust and dirt across his forehead. "The top rail," Vivian Croft said, gesturing with her chin towards the plank he was about to secure. "The slope on this property is 5 degrees. If you run it completely level, it's going to look jagged against the next section. You need to drop the left joint by 1/4 inch. Arthur stared at her, his pulse ticking in his jaw. He looked at the rail. He looked at the slope. He hated that she was right. He hated even more that she, a woman who probably hadn't touched a piece of untreated lumber in her life, saw it before he did. "I was getting to the adjustment," Arthur lied, his voice gravelly from disuse. "No, you weren't," she replied, taking a slow sip from her mug. "But I appreciate the lie. It shows you care about your pride. People without pride do sloppy work." Arthur lowered the hammer. He didn't want to engage. Engaging with the wealthy was a trap. They either wanted to condescend to you or use you as a sounding board for their own bizarre neuroses. "I'll fix the angle, ma'am. Should be done in 2 hours." Vivian didn't leave. She stood there, silent, watching him work. It made his skin prickle. The silence stretched, filled only by the scrape of wood and the distant crashing of the ocean against the cliffs. "Why are your knuckles bleeding?" she asked suddenly. Arthur glanced down at his right hand. He hadn't noticed the split skin over his index finger, the slow ooze of blood mixing with the wood dust. "Slipped. There's a first aid kit in the mudroom. Around the path, code is 4114. I'm fine." "Blood stains the redwood," she said flatly, "and I don't want a biohazard on my perimeter. Go wrap it." She turned and walked back towards the glass house, her footsteps entirely soundless on the manicured grass. Arthur stood in the mud, gripping the handle of his hammer tight enough to turn his knuckles white. He wiped the blood on his jeans, picked up his saw, and adjusted the angle. Mud caked Arthur's boots, adding 5 pounds to each step as he finally walked toward the service entrance. It was exactly 11:40. The fence was seamless, a wall of fresh, fragrant redwood that matched the old grain perfectly. He had swept the patio, bagged the debris, and loaded the shattered planks into his truck. His shoulder screamed in protest with every movement, a sharp, localized burning that promised a sleepless night. He stopped at the edge of the limestone patio, refusing to step onto the pristine stone with his filthy boots. He unclipped his tool belt, dropping it with a heavy clatter onto the grass, and pulled his phone from his pocket. He drafted a quick invoice email to the estate manager who had hired him. Job complete. $400. Direct deposit preferred. Before he could hit send, the sliding glass door clicked open. Vivian stepped out. The damp chill of the morning had vanished, replaced by the harsh midday sun, but she still looked cold. She was holding a manila folder. She didn't look at Arthur immediately. Her eyes swept the length of the fence. She walked to the center of the new section, pressing her pale hand against the wood. She shoved it, hard. The structure didn't yield a millimeter. "Solid," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I don't build things to fall down," Arthur said. He stayed by the edge of the patio, arms crossed over his chest to hide the grease stains on his shirt. Vivian finally turned to him. The sunlight caught her eyes. They were a strange, pale grey, like the ocean before a storm. "Your name is Arthur Pendleton, correct?" "Yeah." "Your contractor profile says you run a 3-man crew. I only saw you today." Arthur shifted his weight off his bad knee. He hated this part. The interrogation, the sudden suspicion that he was trying to pull one over on them. "My guys moved on. Couldn't guarantee them 40 hours a week. It's just me now." "Just you." Vivian walked slowly toward him. The smell of her hit him before she even stopped. Expensive paper, ozone, and something sharp, like crushed mint. "You framed the new commercial development downtown, the Avery building, 5 years ago." Arthur frowned. The Avery building was the biggest job he'd ever managed, before the market dipped and his wife walked out, leaving him with a mountain of debt and a 1-year-old. "I did. Why are you looking into my work history? I just fixed your fence. You owe me $400. "I owe you exactly what we agreed upon," she said, her tone maddeningly even. "But I don't write checks for $400. Panic, hot and immediate, flared in Arthur's chest. He uncrossed his arms. "Look, lady, I don't have time for a runaround. I did the work. It's good work. I need the cash today. If your estate manager has to process it—" "Arthur." She said his name sharply, stopping his words in his throat. She held out the manila folder. "Take it." He hesitated. He looked at the folder, then at her face. There was no malice there, no smug superiority, just an intense, almost uncomfortable focus. He reached out with a blistered, tape-wrapped hand and took the folder. It was heavy. He opened the flap. Inside wasn't a check. It was a stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. On top was a contract. Arthur's eyes scanned the heavy black text. "Primary contracting lead, logistics warehouse development, Sector 4, annual retainer." His eyes dropped to the compensation line. He stopped breathing. He read the number again. It had to be a typo. There were too many zeros. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I own a logistics company," Vivian said, looking out toward the ocean. "We are breaking ground on 3 new distribution centers across the state. I go through contractors like water. They overcharge, they build sloppy, they cut corners on the angles because they think I won't notice. I notice everything." Arthur looked down at the paper. His brain refused to process the information. $250,000. Guaranteed. "You noticed the slope," she continued softly. "You cared about the joint. You bled on your own time to finish a job for a stranger, and you swept my patio when you didn't have to. You're broke, Arthur. Your truck registration is expired. Your boots are held together by duct tape, and you were checking your bank account on your phone every 20 minutes while you worked. I saw you from the window." Arthur felt his face burn. Anger mixed with a deep, humiliating vulnerability. "You spy on your help?" "I observe my investments," she corrected him smoothly. She finally looked back at him. The coldness in her face cracked just a fraction, revealing something desperately lonely underneath. "I have a board of directors who lie to my face every day. I have an ex-husband suing me for a company he didn't build. I live in a glass box, and I can't trust a single person who walks through those gates. I need someone who builds things that don't fall down. I need someone who doesn't cut corners." Arthur stared at her. The wind whipped across the yard, rustling the heavy branches of the surviving trees. He thought about the electrical bill. He thought about the museum. He thought about Chloe's cough and the sound of her struggling to breathe in the dark. "I'm just a carpenter," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're a man trying to survive," Vivian replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek, black metal card. She placed it carefully on top of the documents in his hands. "That's a corporate card. It's active. Go buy your daughter her medicine. Go buy a new tool belt. Read the contract. If you want the job, be at my downtown office on Monday at 8 a.m. She didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't wait for a reaction. She just turned around and walked back toward the sliding glass door. Arthur stood alone on the edge of the lawn. His hands were shaking so violently that the papers rustled against each other. He looked down at the black card, resting heavy and cold against his rough palm. A single drop of rain fell from the grey sky, hitting the surface of the card and shattering into a perfect, tiny star. For the first time in 5 years, Arthur Pendleton didn't have to do the math. Fluorescent lights hummed a harsh, aggressive buzz above aisle 4 of the corner pharmacy. Arthur stood frozen before the cash register, staring at the small digital display. $85. The pharmacist, a kid who couldn't be older than 20 with a patchy beard and a name tag that read Greg, popped his gum. He looked bored. Arthur felt like he was suffocating. He reached into his pocket. His calloused fingers brushed past the familiar, worn leather of his wallet and touched the cold, heavy metal of Vivian Croft's corporate card. It felt radioactive. He pulled it out. The matte black surface absorbed the ugly pharmacy light, the silver chip gleaming like a tiny razor. He slid it into the machine. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs. Declined. That was the word he expected to see. Fraud. Stolen. He braced himself for the humiliating alarm, the sharp look from Greg, the slow walk back to the truck empty-handed. The machine beeped, a cheerful, high-pitched chirp. Approved. A receipt spat from the printer, curling into a long white ribbon. Greg bagged the small cardboard box containing Chloe's inhaler, tossed in the receipt, and pushed it across the counter. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask why a guy in mud-caked boots, smelling of wet redwood, was carrying a card with no limit. He just popped his gum again. Arthur grabbed the bag. His hands were sweating so badly he almost dropped it. He didn't go straight home. He drove to the upscale grocery store across town, the one with the organic produce and the bakery that smelled of yeast and warm butter. He walked through the automatic doors feeling like a trespasser. He grabbed a cart. He threw in fresh strawberries, the bright red ones that didn't have mushy brown spots. He bought a 2-pound ribeye steak, thick and marbled with fat. He bought real maple syrup instead of the corn syrup sludge sitting in his pantry. He bought a small plastic Triceratops toy sitting near the checkout aisle. When he swiped the black card again, the total was $214. Approved. No hesitation. Arthur sat in the cab of his truck in the grocery store parking lot for 20 minutes. The rain had stopped, leaving the windshield smeared with a grey, greasy film. He stared at the steering wheel. He felt a sickening twist in his gut, a sudden, violent wave of nausea. This wasn't a gift. People like Vivian Croft didn't give gifts. They bought equity. They purchased leverage. He had just spent $300 of a billionaire's money, and he didn't even know what it was actually going to cost him. But when he unlocked the door to his cramped, second-floor apartment, the smell of stale carpet and boiled cabbage hitting him in the face, the nausea faded. Mrs. Higgins was asleep in the recliner, the television playing a muted game show. On the worn rug, Chloe was carefully lining up wooden blocks. Her breathing sounded thin, a raspy whistle catching in her throat with every exhale. "Daddy," she croaked, looking up. Her dark hair was a bird's nest of tangles. Arthur dropped the groceries on the linoleum counter. He walked over, knelt on the floor, and pulled the inhaler from his jacket pocket. He shook it, the small metal canister rattling. Time for a puff, bug. She didn't fight him. She opened her mouth, wrapped her lips around the plastic spacer, and inhaled as he pressed the canister. He watched her tiny chest expand. He held up a finger, counting to 10 in his head, before letting her exhale. Within 2 minutes, the whistling sound softened. The color returned to her cheeks. He pulled the plastic triceratops from his pocket and set it on top of her blocks. Chloe's eyes widened. She grabbed it, tracing the plastic horns with her thumb. "Thank you," she whispered. Arthur kissed the top of her head. He tasted salt and cheap shampoo. Museum tomorrow, first thing. Hours later, the apartment was completely silent. Chloe was asleep, her breathing finally deep and steady. Arthur sat at the kitchen table, the only light coming from the yellowish bulb above the stove. The manila folder lay open in front of him. He read the contract 4 times. He was looking for the trap door, the non-compete clause that would ruin him, the liability waiver that would shift the blame of collapsed roofs onto his shoulders, the termination clause that would leave him destitute. It wasn't there. It was a standard retainer. Brutal in its expectations. Milestones were aggressive, penalties for delays were steep, but mathematically fair. More than fair. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning man's hands. Arthur rubbed his thumb over the signature line at the bottom. She had already signed it in crisp, sharp blue ink. Vivian Croft. He thought about her standing on the patio, the wind whipping her hair, looking at him with those strange, pale eyes. I need someone who builds things that don't fall down. She was surrounded by wealth, isolated by it, suffocated by yes men and corporate vultures. She saw a guy covered in mud who wouldn't compromise on a 5-degree angle, and she bought him. Arthur picked up a cheap ballpoint pen. The plastic casing was cracked. He pressed the tip to the paper and signed his name. Monday morning tasted like exhaust fumes and stale coffee. Arthur parked his truck in the subterranean garage of the Croft Logistics Tower. His Ford looked absurd, sitting between a silver Porsche and a matte black Mercedes SUV. It leaked a single drop of oil onto the pristine epoxy floor. Arthur watched it fall, feeling a petty spike of satisfaction. He took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The ride was entirely silent, your ears popping twice as the box shot upward at a sickening speed. Arthur tugged at the collar of his shirt. He had ironed his best denim button-down, but the elbows were still frayed, and his boots, though scrubbed, were permanently scarred with drywall mud and paint. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The reception area was a massive expanse of polished concrete, white marble, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. It smelled like chilled air and expensive eucalyptus. A woman behind a minimalist desk looked up. Her smile was practiced, flawless, and completely dead behind the eyes. "Can I help you?" Her gaze flicked to his boots. "Arthur Pendleton. I'm here to see Vivian Croft." The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Pendleton? Deliveries are usually routed through the loading dock on level B." Arthur didn't flinch. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out the signed contract, and laid it flat on her spotless marble desk. Beside it, he placed the black corporate card. "Call her." The woman's eyes darted from the card to the contract, her flawless smile faltering. She picked up a phone, pressed a single button, and spoke in hushed tones. 10 seconds later, Double glass doors at the end of the hall swung open. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped out. He looked to be in his late 20s with slicked back hair and a Bluetooth earpiece. "Mr. Pendleton, Miss Croft is finishing a board call. Follow me." Arthur grabbed his papers and the card. He followed the suit down a hallway, lined with abstract art that looked like spilled ink. The corporate hum of the building, muffled keyboards, ringing phones, hushed conversations, was entirely alien to him. He was used to the scream of circular saws and the heavy thud of nail guns. They entered a corner office. It was vast, dominated by a massive oak desk and more glass. Vivian stood by the window, her back to him. She was on a headset. She wore a tailored grey suit today, the jacket sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't care what the Port Authority says, Marcus," she was saying, her voice tight, echoing slightly in the large room. "If the container sits in Long Beach for another 48 hours, the spoilage will cost us $3 million. Route it through Oakland. Pay the premium, just move the damn freight." She tapped a button on her desk, cutting the call. She didn't turn around immediately. She took a slow, deep breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "They want me to compromise on the transit lines because fuel costs spiked Thursday," she said, staring out at the smog-layered horizon. "They think short-term. They think about quarterly reports. They don't think about the foundation rotting out from under them." She finally turned. Her eyes locked onto Arthur. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a greeting. She looked at his ironed shirt, his clean boots, and the folder in his hand. "You signed it," she said. "I signed it," Arthur replied, his voice rough. He walked forward, stopping a few feet from her desk. He dropped the folder onto the wood. "But we need to get a few things straight before I take a hammer to a single piece of your framing." The suit hovering near the door shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, you can't just—" "Leave us, David," Vivian interrupted, her eyes never leaving Arthur's face. David swallowed hard and practically fled the room, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind him. The silence rushed in, thick and pressurized. Vivian crossed her arms. "Go on." "I read the blueprints for Sector 4, Arthur said, planting his feet. "Your architects designed the warehouse support columns using low-grade structural steel to save on weight. The soil in that valley is clay. It shifts. If you build it their way, the concrete will crack in 3 years and you'll spend double on retrofitting." Vivian's brow twitched. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. The engineering firms signed off on it. "They signed off on the math. They didn't sign off on reality," Arthur countered, leaning forward slightly. "I'm upgrading the steel to high tensile. It's going to cost you an extra $100,000 in materials. Secondly, I don't use corporate crews. I hire my own guys. I vet them. I pay them my rate, not your HR department's rate. You hired me to build things that don't fall down. That means I build it my way." He waited for the explosion. He waited for her to rip the contract in half and have security throw him out. He had walked in here and immediately demanded control from a woman who controlled a global empire. It was suicide. Vivian stared at him. The silence stretched so long Arthur could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Vivian walked around the desk. She stopped right in front of him. She smelled of espresso and that same crushed mint. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched deep into the corners of her eyes. The faint tremor in her left hand as she crossed her arms again. 100,000 in materials, she repeated softly. "Yes." "And you handle the crew?" "Yes." Vivian picked up a pen from her desk. She opened the folder, flipped to the material specifications appendix, crossed out a line of text with a violent slash of blue ink, and wrote in the margin. She handed the folder back to him. "High tensile steel is approved," she said flatly. "You start Wednesday. Don't make me regret this, Arthur." Arthur took the folder. The cardboard felt heavy, grounding him. He looked at her, seeing past the billionaire armor for the first time. She wasn't just tired, she was cornered. She needed a win, a solid foundation, as desperately as he needed the money. "I don't build things to fall down, Ms. Croft." "Vivienne," she corrected, turning her back to him to look out the window again. "I'll see you at the site." Diesel smoke coated the back of Arthur's throat, tasting like burnt pennies and wet earth. Sector 4 was a 70-acre scar of excavated red clay on the edge of the industrial district. 2 weeks into the job, the site was a chaotic symphony of heavy machinery, shouting men, and the relentless, rhythmic pounding of pile drivers sinking concrete anchors into the stubborn ground. Arthur stood on the tailgate of his Ford, a rolled-up set of schematics tucked under his arm. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since he signed Vivienne's contract. His joints ached with a deep, persistent throb, but it was a different kind of pain now. It wasn't the desperate, hollow ache of poverty. It was the heavy, satisfying exhaustion of momentum. He had pulled his old crew back together. Jimmy, a guy with a rap sheet for unpaid parking tickets and a savant-like understanding of load-bearing concrete, was currently screaming at a backhoe operator. Miller and Davis, 2 brothers who could frame a wall faster than a machine, were laying out the perimeter lines. Arthur paid them 20% above the union rate. They worked like men who knew they had been handed a lifeboat. A flatbed semi-truck groaned past the security gate, its air brakes hissing violently as it kicked up a cloud of rust-colored dust. Arthur wiped his eyes, squinting at the load strapped to the trailer. Massive grey I-beams, the structural steel. He hopped off the tailgate, his bad knee absorbing the impact with a sharp twinge, and walked toward the flatbed. The supplier, a thick-necked guy named Richards wearing a pristine yellow hard hat, hopped out of the cab holding a clipboard. "Pendleton," Richards barked, spitting a sunflower seed onto the dirt. "Got your delivery. Need a signature so I can get my rig out of this mud pit." Arthur didn't take the clipboard. He walked past Richards, stepping up onto the side of the trailer. He pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped the grease off the stamped serial number on the closest I-beam. He read the prefix. He rubbed the metal again, thinking he had misread it through the grime. A 3/6, standard carbon steel, not high tensile. Arthur's stomach bottomed out, followed immediately by a spike of heat that traveled straight up his spine. He jumped down from the trailer. He walked right up to Richards, invading the man's personal space. The smell of cheap cologne and stale coffee wafted off the supplier. "Where's the grade 50?" Arthur asked, his voice deadly quiet. Richards shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the clipboard. "Supply chain issues, buddy. Mill in Ohio got backed up. The A36 meets the original architectural specs. It'll hold the roof just fine. You wouldn't even know the difference once the drywall goes up. I ordered high tensile. The contract specifies high tensile. And I'm telling you I don't have it," Richards sneered, his patience vanishing. "You want to delay this project 3 weeks waiting for the premium stuff? Croft Logistics will eat you alive for the downtime. Sign the paper, Carpenter." Arthur snatched the clipboard out of Richards's hand. He didn't sign it. He gripped the cheap plastic board with both hands and snapped it over his knee. The plastic shattered with a loud crack, sending the manifest papers fluttering into the mud. "Hey!" Richards yelled, stepping forward, his hands balling into fists. "Get this truck off my site," Arthur said, dropping the broken pieces at Richards's boots. "If this rig isn't rolling back through that gate in 60 seconds, I'm calling the crane operator to drag it off. You tried to bill a billionaire for premium steel and dump the cheap scrap on her site to pocket the margin. I will personally make sure you never supply a commercial build in this state again." Richard stared at him, face flushing a dark, mottled purple. He looked around. Jimmy had stopped yelling at the backhoe. Miller and Davis were walking over, holding heavy steel crowbars. The crew was circling. Richard swore, spat into the mud, and climbed back into the cab. The engine roared to life, and the truck began a clumsy, grinding three-point turn to leave. Arthur stood perfectly still, watching the dust settle. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a sickening adrenaline dump that left his hands shaking. He hated confrontation. It was messy. It was a risk. That was an expensive temper tantrum. Arthur whipped around. Vivian Croft was standing 20 feet away, near the entrance of the temporary site trailer. She wore a tailored black trench coat, sunglasses hiding her eyes, and leather boots that were already ruined by the red clay. He had no idea how long she had been standing there. He didn't apologize. He walked over to her, his boots heavy with mud. He tried to slip Standard Steel past us, wanted to pocket the price difference. "I know," Vivian said, her voice betraying absolutely nothing. "I audited his invoice this morning. I came down here to fire him." Arthur stopped. "You knew?" "I knew." She took off her sunglasses. The harsh afternoon light revealed the brutal exhaustion in her pale eyes. "I wanted to see what you would do. Most contractors would have signed the paper, taken a kickback from Richards, and poured the concrete. I told you, I don't build things to fall down." Vivian looked past him, watching the flatbed truck lumber out of the gate. She pulled her trench coat tighter against the wind. "You have 3 weeks to find a new steel supplier, Arthur. If we miss the Phase 1 deadline, my board will use it to trigger a vote of no confidence. They want this project to fail so they can sell off the logistics division to a competitor." She wasn't looking at him as a subordinate anymore. She was looking at him like a co-conspirator. "I'll find the steel," Arthur said, the weight of her empire suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. "Good," she murmured. She turned to walk back to her waiting SUV. "Send me the bill for the clipboard." Rain lashed against the single-pane windows of Arthur's apartment, a violent driving storm that drowned out the usual sirens and traffic noise. It was nearly midnight. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and the sterile chemical scent of the heavy-duty cleaner Mrs. Higgins used on the linoleum. Arthur sat at the cramped table, the harsh glare of his cheap laptop illuminating his exhausted face. He had spent the last 5 hours calling every steel mill and distribution yard on the West Coast. Nothing. High-tensile steel was back-ordered everywhere. The supply chain was choking on a massive federal infrastructure bill, and a single warehouse in California wasn't a priority for anyone. He rubbed his eyes until they burned. His bank account currently sat at a balance of $32,000, his first retainer installment. He had bought Chloe a new mattress. He had paid off the electric bill, the gas bill, and the terrifying mountain of medical debt from her hospital visit last winter. He should have felt secure. Instead, he felt a crushing, suffocating panic. If he couldn't find the steel, Vivian would miss her deadline. The board would oust her. His contract would be voided by the new management, and he'd be right back to fixing rich people's fences to survive. His phone vibrated against the table. The screen glowed in the dark. Vivian Croft. He picked it up, his throat tight. "Pendleton, are you asleep?" Her voice was thin, slightly distorted by the bad connection, but it lacked its usual sharp, commanding edge. It sounded hollow. "No, working the supply lines." "Stop." The line went quiet for a moment. He could hear the sound of wind howling in the background, a hollow, echoing rush of air. "Come to Sector 4, now." She hung up. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, threw on his damp Carhartt jacket, and walked out into the storm. The drive took 20 minutes. The industrial district was a ghost town at night, entirely devoid of life, except for the pulsing amber lights of the street sweepers. When he pulled up to the security gate of Sector 4, it was wide open. The guard shack was empty. He drove his truck through the mud, his headlights cutting through the driving rain. Parked in the center of the excavated clay pit, right where the main warehouse floor was supposed to be, was Vivian's black SUV. The headlights were off. Arthur parked next to it, killed the engine, and grabbed a heavy maglite from his glove box. He stepped out into the freezing rain. The mud sucked at his boots, threatening to pull him down with every step. He walked up to the driver's side of the SUV. The window rolled down halfway. Vivian was sitting in the driver's seat. She had shed the tailored trench coat, wearing only a wrinkled white silk blouse. Her hair was down, hanging in wet, tangled strands around her face. The dashboard lights cast pale, bruised shadows under her eyes. She was holding a heavy crystal tumbler, the amber liquid inside sloshing violently as she shivered. "Get in," she said, her teeth chattering slightly. Arthur walked around to the passenger side and climbed in. The interior of the car smelled heavily of expensive scotch and damp leather. The heater was off. It was freezing. "What are you doing out here, Vivian?" Arthur asked, his voice low, trying not to spook her. She looked utterly, completely shattered. She took a slow, agonizing sip from the glass. The ice clinked. "My ex-husband filed an injunction this evening. He claims the intellectual property for the logistics routing software belongs to him. The board held an emergency session at 9 o'clock. They asked me to step down." Arthur felt the cold seep into his bones. "Did you?" "No." She let her head fall back against the headrest, staring up at the roof of the car. "I told them to go to hell. I told them if they try to remove me before this warehouse is operational, I'll burn the entire company down and salt the earth. I'll leak the safety violations from Sector 2 to the federal regulators. I'll destroy the stock price." Arthur stared at her. The sheer, terrifying ruthlessness of it was staggering. She was a woman cornered by wolves, deciding to light the forest on fire to survive. "You're bluffing," he said softly. Vivian turned her head to look at him. In the dim light, her eyes were completely dead. "I don't bluff, Arthur. If I lose this company, I have nothing. It is the only thing I have ever built." She offered him the glass. He didn't want it, but he took it. He took a long drag of the scotch. It burned a hot, vicious trail down his throat, pooling in his stomach like a lit match. He handed it back. "I can't find the steel," Arthur admitted, the truth tasting worse than the liquor. "Every mill is tapped out. We're going to miss the deadline." Vivian didn't react. She just took another sip. "Then we pour the foundation and frame it with standard steel." "No." Arthur shook his head violently. "You hired me because I don't cut corners. If we build on standard steel, this place will buckle in 3 years. Your legacy will literally collapse." "I don't have 3 years, Arthur," Vivian snapped, her voice finally breaking, a sudden raw spike of emotion shattering her icy exterior. She slammed her hand against the steering wheel. "I have 3 weeks. If the skeleton isn't up, they fire me. I lose. He wins. The board wins. They strip it down and sell it for parts." The rain hammered against the roof of the SUV, a deafening drumbeat. Arthur looked out the windshield at the muddy, empty pit. He thought about Chloe's new mattress. He thought about the electric bill. He thought about Richards, the supplier, smiling his greasy smile. "There is a way," Arthur said slowly, the idea forming in his head like a dangerous spark. "But it's illegal." Vivian stopped moving. She slowly lowered the glass. "How illegal?" "Repurposing structural salvage," Arthur muttered, wiping the condensation off the window. "There's an abandoned naval shipyard in Oakland. They're tearing down the old submarine dry docks. Those cranes are built with military-grade, high-tensile steel. It's better than anything we could buy today. If we buy the scrap rights, I can have my crew cut it down, haul it here, and weld it to spec." Vivian stared at him. "You want to build a state-of-the-art logistics hub out of rusty submarine parts. The steel is sound. The aesthetic is terrible." Arthur looked her in the eye. "But the building inspectors won't pass it. It violates a dozen modern sourcing codes. We'd have to bribe the inspector to look the other way when he signs off on the framing." He waited for her to reject it. She was a CEO. She dealt in corporate warfare, not blue-collar bribery. Vivian looked out at the mud. The silence stretched for a full minute, thick and heavy. Then she reached into the center console, pulled out her phone, and opened her contacts. "What's the inspector's name?" she asked, her voice cold as ice. Ozone and burning rust choked the freezing midnight air. The Oakland Naval Shipyard was a graveyard of American industry, a sprawling expanse of cracked concrete and skeletal gantry cranes jutting into the black water of the bay. Arthur pulled his welding hood down, plunging his world into darkness before squeezing the trigger on the plasma cutter. A blinding blue-white arc ignited. Sparks showered over his heavy leather apron, bouncing off the steel-toed boots he'd bought with Vivian's card. He was cutting through a primary support strut of a decommissioned dry dock. The steel was 3 inches thick, dense and heavily oxidized, fighting the plasma cutter every millimeter of the way. It smelled like ancient salt and vaporized iron. "Watch the shear!" Jimmy screamed over the roar of the portable diesel generator. He was standing 20 feet back, holding a massive tension cable hooked to a rented flatbed. Arthur killed the torch and flipped his hood up. The heat radiating from the freshly cut metal seared the damp chill right off his face. The massive beam groaned, a horrific, shrieking sound of tearing metal. "Pull it!" Arthur yelled. Jimmy threw the winch engine into gear. The cable went taut, humming with terrifying kinetic energy. With a final, agonizing snap, the 40-foot beam broke free, crashing onto the concrete with an impact that vibrated straight up Arthur's spine and rattled his teeth. They had been at this for 4 nights, stealing steel. Technically, Vivian had purchased the salvage rights through a shell corporation, but the permits explicitly forbade repurposing the materials for commercial load-bearing structures. It was a felony masking as a desperate recycling project. Miller and Davis rushed forward with heavy grinders, immediately attacking the jagged ends to prep them for transport. They worked in frantic, terrified silence. They were making triple their usual rate, paid in cash from a duffel bag Vivian had left in Arthur's truck. Money bought sweat, but it also bought complicity. By dawn, they had hauled 60 tons of military-grade steel back to Sector 4. The drop-off was always the worst part. The daylight made everything feel exposed. Arthur stood by the trench of the main foundation, drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos, watching the cranes lower the rusted, ugly beams into the fresh mud. It looked wrong. It looked like a junkyard. Tires crunched on the gravel access road. Arthur turned. A white city municipal car parked next to Vivian's sleek SUV. A man stepped out. He was heavy-set, wearing a cheap windbreaker that strained over his gut and carrying a yellow clipboard. Tom Kowalski, the senior building inspector for the district. Vivian met him halfway. She wasn't wearing a trench coat today. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and slacks, looking entirely out of place in the red mud. Yet she moved with the predatory grace of a shark navigating a reef. Arthur walked over, keeping his distance but staying close enough to hear. He gripped his heavy steel tape measure like a weapon. "Ms. Croft," Kowalski said, his voice a wet, raspy wheeze. He didn't look at her face. His eyes swept over the rusted beams sitting in the trench. "I got a call about non-standard materials on this site. I'm looking at what appears to be naval salvage." "You're looking at high-tensile, reinforced structural steel, Mr. Kowalski," Vivian replied smoothly. "I don't care if it's vibranium, lady. It doesn't have a mill stamp. It doesn't have an origin manifest. I have to red tag this site." He clicked his pen, a loud, obnoxious sound in the quiet morning air. "Shut it down. Everybody goes home." Arthur's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, ready to argue the load-bearing math, ready to fight for the perimeter he was building. Vivian held up a single, manicured hand, stopping Arthur in his tracks. She took a step closer to Kowalski. The inspector was a full head taller than her, but he suddenly seemed to shrink. "Your daughter," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate whisper. "She was accepted into USC's veterinary program last week. Out-of-state tuition. That's roughly $65,000 a year, plus housing." Kowalski stopped clicking his pen. His face lost a fraction of its color. "Excuse me?" "You make $82,000 a year, Tom," Vivian continued, not breaking eye contact. "Your wife's bakery filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in August. You have a second mortgage on your house in the valley. You cannot afford USC. "Are you threatening me?" Kowalski hissed, glancing around nervously. "I am observing your reality," Vivian said flatly. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. She didn't hand it to him, she just held it. "There is a grant, the Croft Foundation for Biological Sciences. It is fully funded, anonymous, and covers 4 years of tuition and board. The paperwork is finalized. It just needs a signature from the foundation director. Me." Kowalski stared at the envelope. He swallowed hard. The moral high ground was dissolving under his cheap orthotics, washing away in the red clay. "The steel is stronger than the architectural specs," Arthur interjected gruffly, providing the man a flimsy psychological out. "It'll hold a Category 5 hurricane. It's safe." Kowalski didn't look at Arthur. He kept his eyes on Vivian. He reached out, his thick fingers trembling slightly, and took the envelope. He slipped it into his windbreaker. "The steel," Kowalski said, his voice entirely devoid of breath, "appears to meet the structural integrity requirements of the county. I will sign off on the framing phase." He turned and walked back to his city car, his shoulders slumped. Vivian didn't watch him drive away. She turned to Arthur. Her eyes were hollow, exhausted, completely drained of the adrenaline that had just fueled the extortion. "Get it in the ground, Arthur," she said softly, "before someone else comes looking." Rain gave way to a punishing, unseasonable heat wave that baked the clay of Sector 4 into concrete. For 12 days, the site was a brutal theatre of fire and noise. Arthur's crew worked in staggered shifts, 24 hours a day, welding the massive naval beams together. The structure rising from the dirt was the ugliest thing Arthur had ever built. It was a patchwork monster. The columns were different shades of faded battleship grey, flaking green primer, and deep, violent rust. But every time Arthur inspected a joint, running his gloved hand over the thick, flawless titanium welds Jimmy laid down, he felt a profound sense of pride. It wasn't pretty, but it was indestructible. It was a Saturday morning, 3 days before the Phase 1 deadline. The massive skeletal framework of the warehouse was finally complete, casting jagged geometric shadows across the baked earth. Arthur was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, wrapping a fresh bandage around a burn on his forearm. The skin was blistered and raw, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Beside him, sitting on a turned-over bucket, was Chloe. She wore a bright yellow hard hat that swallowed her small head, and miniature safety glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She was eating a powdered donut, kicking her feet in the air. Her breathing was perfectly clear. The new medicine, bought with Vivian's card, worked like magic. "It looks like dinosaur bones," Chloe mumbled through a mouthful of sugar, pointing a small, sticky finger at the massive steel arches. "Yeah, bug," Arthur smiled, tying off the bandage with his teeth and his good hand. "A big, ugly metal dinosaur. I think it possesses a certain brutalist charm." Arthur jumped. Vivian was standing a few feet away. She had a habit of appearing without making a sound, like a ghost haunting her own property. Today she wore dark jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and heavy work boots. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked 5 years younger than the woman who had bribed the inspector. Chloe stopped chewing. She stared at Vivian with wide, unblinking eyes. "Hi," Chloe said tentatively. Vivian looked down at the little girl. The billionaire CEO, a woman who routinely crushed corporate rivals and extorted city officials, suddenly looked entirely out of her depth. She offered a stiff, awkward wave. "Hello," Vivian said. "Are you the site supervisor?" Chloe giggled, a bright, chiming sound that cut through the industrial hum of the generators. "No, I'm Chloe. My dad builds things." "He does," Vivian agreed softly. She looked up at the skeletal warehouse. "He builds very strong things." Before Arthur could speak, the harsh crunch of tires on gravel shattered the quiet moment. A sleek, silver Mercedes sedan sped through the open security gate, ignoring the 5-mile-per-hour limit, and slammed on its brakes in a cloud of dust right next to the foundation trench. A man stepped out. He was tall, impeccably groomed, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than Arthur's truck. He carried a leather briefcase and an expression of supreme, condescending authority. "Ms. Croft," the man shouted, slamming the car door. "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." Vivian's posture instantly changed. The awkward, soft woman talking to a child vanished, replaced by the shark. Her spine stiffened, her jaw locking into a sharp angle. "Hayes," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a glacial temperature. "You're trespassing on an active construction site without PPE. Get back in your car." "I represent the board," Hayes sneered, walking purposefully toward them. He stopped a few feet away, pulling a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. "And we are executing an emergency halt on this project. We ran a drone over the site yesterday. This structure is a farce. You're using uncertified scrap metal. It's a massive liability violation, and the board has formally filed for a cease and desist." Arthur stood up, positioning his body slightly between Hayes and Chloe. "The county inspector signed off on the framing," Vivian said evenly. "The site is compliant." "Kowalski is a hack," Hayes snapped. "We have our own structural engineers arriving in 1 hour to audit this monstrosity. When they prove this steel is non-compliant, you will be in breach of your fiduciary duty. The vote to remove you is scheduled for Monday." Hayes looked past Vivian, his eyes landing on Arthur. He sneered, taking in the dirty jeans, the burn bandage, the exhausted posture. "And as for you, whatever 2-bit operation you're running, you'll be sued into oblivion for gross negligence." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't puff out his chest. He calmly reached into the bed of his truck, picked up a 3-foot, solid steel heavy-duty pry bar, and let it rest casually against his shoulder. The metal weighed 30 pounds. He held it like it was a toothpick. He walked slowly toward Hayes. The corporate lawyer didn't move at first, relying on his suit and his status as a shield. But as Arthur got closer, the sheer physical reality of a man who spent his life bending metal and breaking concrete began to register. Hayes took a small, involuntary step back. "The structural steel on this site," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "is high-tensile naval salvage. It's designed to withstand deep-sea pressure and torpedo impacts. Your engineers are going to come out here, they're going to test it, and they're going to find out that this building is the strongest thing in a 50-mile radius." Arthur stopped 2 feet from Hayes. He leaned in. He smelled expensive cologne and nervous sweat. "Now," Arthur whispered, "you are scaring my daughter. Get off my sight." Hayes looked at the pry bar. He looked at Arthur's cold, dead eyes. He swallowed, his throat clicking audibly. He shoved the papers back into his briefcase, turned, and fast walked back to his Mercedes. He didn't look back as he sped out of the gate. Arthur lowered the pry bar. The adrenaline faded, leaving him hollow and shaking slightly. He turned around. Vivian was staring at him. Her pale eyes were wide, reflecting the jagged steel of the warehouse behind him. For the first time since he had met her on that pristine patio, she wasn't hiding behind a mask of corporate stoicism. She looked deeply, profoundly relieved. "They're going to test it," Vivian said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let them," Arthur replied, dropping the heavy pry bar onto the tailgate. "I told you, it won't fall down." Monday morning arrived with the taste of copper and stale adrenaline. Sector 4 was eerily quiet, the heavy machinery sitting idle under a low-hanging coastal fog. Arthur stood at the edge of the foundation trench, a styrofoam cup of black coffee warming his raw, calloused hands. 3 white cargo vans were parked near the security gate. 6 men in spotless safety gear swarmed the skeletal framework of the warehouse. They moved like forensic pathologists picking over a metallic corpse. Vivian stood right beside Arthur in a heavy charcoal overcoat, her breath pluming in the damp air. She hadn't spoken a single word in 45 minutes. A technician on a scissor lift pressed an ultrasonic transducer against a scraped section of column. A high-pitched whine cut through the fog. The man stared at his ruggedized tablet, frowned, applied a smear of blue couplant gel, and pressed the probe to the cold metal again. "They think their equipment is busted," Jimmy muttered, leaning against Arthur's truck. He spat a sunflower seed shell into the mud. "They're calibrating for standard commercial grade. That's HY80 naval steel up there. Their little iPads literally can't comprehend the math." Arthur's chest was impossibly tight, a dull ache radiating from his bad knee. He watched Hayes pacing near the vans. The corporate lawyer aggressively chewed gum, a phone pressed to his ear, his expensive Italian loafers sinking into the caustic red clay. He looked eager for the kill. Finally, the lead engineer signaled the lift down. He walked over to Hayes, pointing a pen at his tablet. Arthur couldn't hear the words, but the body language was deafening. The engineer shook his head. Hayes stopped chewing. His arrogant posture collapsed. Hayes shoved his phone away and walked across the rutted clay toward Vivian. The condescending sneer was gone, replaced by a tight, bloodless grimace. "Well?" Vivian asked, her voice carrying sharply. "The tensile strength is—" Hayes swallowed, refusing to look at Arthur. "It registers at roughly 85,000 psi. The architectural requirement was 36. So it exceeds compliance, Vivian stated flatly. It's an anomaly. It violates standard procurement protocols. Is it structurally sound, Hayes? She interrupted, her tone cutting bone. Yes, the lawyer conceded, the word tasting like ash. The engineers signed the affidavit. The board withdrew the injunction. The vote is cancelled. Vivian didn't gloat. She simply nodded. Tell the board if they ever send a drone over my site again, I'll have security shoot it out of the sky. Now get off my property. Hayes turned and walked away, his ruined shoes dragging through the mud. The suffocating tension evaporated, leaving Arthur with a crushing wave of physical exhaustion. He dumped his coffee onto the dirt. He had done it. The contract was safe. He turned to his crew. Jimmy, fire up the generators. We have a roof to frame. 6 months later, coastal wind whipped across the pristine black asphalt of Sector 4. The ugly, rusted skeleton was gone, swallowed by an immaculate facility of corrugated steel and tinted glass. The loading docks were a masterpiece of organized chaos, semi-trucks backing into bays with loud, rhythmic beeps. Arthur sat in the driver's seat of a brand new F250. It smelled like factory plastic and clean leather. He missed the stench of motor oil and sawdust, but the heated seats worked miracles on his knee. The passenger door opened and Vivian slid in. The bruised bags under her eyes were gone. She wore a beige cashmere sweater and held a sleek leather folio. The automated lines are running at 98%, she said, buckling her seatbelt. We're routing 10,000 packages an hour. My ex-husband dropped his lawsuit yesterday. Good, Arthur grunted, putting the truck in park. So we're done here. The primary build is done, Vivian corrected, unzipping the folio. But Sector 5 breaks ground in Sacramento next month, Sector 6 in Nevada by spring. She handed him a single sheet of heavy, textured paper. Arthur wiped his hands on his jeans before taking it, expecting another retainer agreement. But as his eyes scanned the legal jargon, his heart hammered a terrifying rhythm against his ribs. It wasn't a labor contract. It was a certificate of incorporation, Pendleton and Croft Infrastructure. Ownership breakdown, 51% Vivian Croft, 49% Arthur Pendleton. I dissolved the real estate division, Vivian said, softly, staring at the indestructible warehouse he had built. I'm spinning the physical development into a new subsidiary. I need a managing partner, someone who doesn't cut corners. Arthur's mouth went completely dry. This wasn't just money. This was equity, a legacy, college tuition for Chloe, a life where he never had to check his bank balance in a pharmacy ever again. Vivian, he choked out, his voice cracking violently. I don't have the capital to buy into— Your sweat equity covered it, she interrupted. Her pale grey eyes were warm, devoid of corporate armour. You saved my company. I build things with people who stand in the mud with a pry bar when the suits show up. She tapped the paper. Sign it, and go pick up Chloe. She wanted to go to the museum again, didn't she? Arthur stared at the paper. His rough hands shook violently. He reached into the console, pulling out the same cracked plastic pen he had used to sign that first contract. He looked at the billionaire sitting next to him, and for the first time in his life, Arthur Pendleton was utterly, completely speechless. Did Vivian's ultimate reward leave you as speechless as Arthur? Sometimes, the most unbreakable bonds are forged in the mud, built on a foundation of raw grit and unyielding integrity. When you refuse to cut corners, the universe has a way of paying you back in ways you never thought possible. If Arthur's journey from a broken fence to a boardroom legacy inspired you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that hard work truly pays off. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories and drop a comment below.